Imagine roasting a piece of meat over a fire, taking one bite, and thinking, this needs something. Unfortunately, your kitchen contains no salt shaker, no grocery store, and no tiny paper packet hiding beside the ketchup. You are a prehistoric human. Your seasoning aisle is the entire landscape. So did somebody simply lick a white rock one afternoon and invent salt? Probably not. The strange part is that humans did not need culture to tell them sodium mattered. Our bodies already depended on it, and mammals have biological systems that can make salt suddenly very attractive when sodium runs low. Long before anyone understood chemistry, the body was already sending complaints to management. The real mystery is how that craving became knowledge. Maybe people encountered mineral crusts. Maybe they drank from salty springs. Maybe they noticed animals repeatedly returning to the same strange patch of ground. We cannot know the first moment because salt has an annoying archaeological habit. It dissolves. But thousands of years ago, some communities stopped merely finding salty places. They began processing them. And that is where a basic biological need starts turning into technology. Let's go back to the beginning. The short answer is that ancient humans probably encountered salt naturally long before they ever learned to manufacture it. Salt was already present in animal tissues, coastal water, mineral deposits, and springs bubbling up through salt-rich rock. You do not need chemistry to notice that some water tastes different, some mineral crusts taste salty, or that certain places keep attracting animals again and again. But encountering salt is not the same as discovering how to use it. There are really 3 steps here. First, you taste something salty. Second, you remember where it came from and deliberately return to it. Third, you figure out how to take that salt with you. That last step changes everything. A salty spring is useful while you are standing beside it. Concentrated salt can travel back to camp, season food, be stored, shared, and eventually exchanged. Suddenly, a taste in the landscape becomes an object. And this is where archaeology finally begins to see the story more clearly. Not at the first lick, which vanished without leaving a receipt, but when people started repeating the same actions around concentrated salt sources. So, the discovery of salt was probably not one brilliant moment. It was a staircase. And the first step may have been built into the human body itself. Why would any of this matter enough for a prehistoric human to remember? Because sodium is not just seasoning. It is part of the machinery keeping an animal alive. Sodium helps regulate the fluid outside your cells, and the electrical activity of nerves and muscles depends on tightly controlled concentrations of ions. Lose enough sodium. And the body does not respond by calmly waiting for you to invent nutrition science. It changes your behavior. In mammals, sodium depletion can trigger a specific salt appetite. Hormones involved in maintaining fluid balance, including aldosterone and angiotensin, help push the brain towards seeking and consuming sodium. Experiments show that sodium-depleted animals can strongly prefer salty solutions even without having learned beforehand that those solutions will fix the problem. That does not mean a prehistoric human could look at a mineral deposit and think, excellent, electrolytes. The body does not explain itself. It simply makes certain things suddenly worth finding. And this gives us a much more plausible starting point for the salt story. Long before people could manufacture white crystals, natural selection had already built mammals that could detect sodium-related cues, respond to deficiency, and alter their behavior accordingly. Culture came later. The chemistry department was already open. Here is where the neat story usually appears. Humans became farmers. They started eating more cultivated plants, keeping herds, storing food for longer periods, and suddenly salt became important. It sounds convincing. It is also too tidy. Agriculture probably did increase the usefulness of concentrated salt. Herd animals need sodium too, and later societies clearly used salt for livestock, curing meat and fish, and extending the storage life of food. Once people settled down and managed larger stores of food and animals, a reliable salt source could become extremely valuable. But that does not mean farmers discovered salt. Humans had been eating animal tissues and moving through landscapes containing coastlines, mineral springs, and natural salt deposits long before the Neolithic. Their physiology did not suddenly develop a sodium requirement because somebody planted wheat. What farming seems to change is the scale of the problem. A mobile forager might encounter sodium through food and landscape. A farming community with stored crops, livestock, permanent settlements, and many mouths to feed could benefit from obtaining concentrated salt repeatedly, predictably, and in larger quantities. So, the Neolithic may not mark the birth of salt awareness. It may mark something more important for archaeology, the point when salt increasingly became something communities organized labor to produce. Which creates one frustrating question. If humans knew salt much earlier, where is all the evidence? This is where salt becomes an archaeologist's nightmare. Imagine trying to prove that somebody used a stone axe 8,000 years ago. Conveniently, the stone axe is still there. Now imagine trying to prove they collected salt. The salt was eaten, or dissolved, or washed into the soil, or disappeared back into water as if it had hired a very competent lawyer. So, archaeologists often have to search for everything around the salt instead. They look for places where naturally salty water emerges from the ground. They look for repeated hearths, thick ash deposits, reddened soil, unusual ceramic fragments, and microscopic minerals trapped inside burned sediments. In later prehistoric salt-making sites, they sometimes find something especially useful: briquetage. The broken remains of ceramic equipment used to heat brine and help produce transportable salt cakes. The container survives. Dinner does not. And that distinction matters because the earliest exploitation of salt may predate the widespread appearance of briquetage. If archaeologists searched only for specialized pottery, they could miss older techniques that used fire, organic materials, or methods that left little more than ashes behind. Which means a prehistoric saltworking site might not look impressive at all. No glittering pile of white crystals, no warehouse, no helpful sign saying "salt factory," just burned ground, ash, charcoal, and evidence that people came back to the same salty place and did something involving water and fire again and again. That is exactly why one site in the hills of what is now Romania became so important. There, beside an unusually concentrated salt spring, archaeologists found enormous accumulations of combustion debris dating back thousands of years. At first glance, it looks like prehistoric people were extremely committed to making a mess. Under a microscope, however, that mess starts behaving like a recipe, and it preserves one of the earliest clear glimpses we have of humans deliberately working salt. Now we can finally visit the crime scene. In northeastern Romania, near the village of Lunca, a natural spring pushes extremely salty water out of the ground. Even today, the spring is still used. Its brine contains roughly 160 grams of salt per liter, several times the concentration of ordinary seawater. Beside it sits Poiana Slatinei, and prehistoric people made an extraordinary mess there. Archaeologists uncovered a stratified mound roughly 60 meters long and 25 meters wide, built from layer after layer of ash, charcoal, and soil reddened by intense heat. In places, the accumulation reaches almost 3 meters thick. This was not one unlucky campfire. People returned again and again. Radiocarbon dates from the earliest deposits place salt exploitation roughly between 6,000 and 50 and 5,500 BC, during the early Neolithic. That makes Poiana Slatinei one of the earliest securely documented saltworking sites known. But what exactly were people doing? Later microscopic and geochemical analysis gave archaeologists a much closer look. Researchers identified repeated hearths, ash over heat-reddened surfaces, sodium and chlorine in early Neolithic ashes, and sedimentary traces consistent with salty water interacting with combustion structures. The leading reconstruction is wonderfully simple. Collect concentrated natural brine. Build a fire. Pour brine onto hot combustion structures. Use the heat to drive off water. Repeat. Exactly how the resulting salt was gathered at this early stage is harder to reconstruct because nobody left an instruction manual. Later, salt makers often used ceramic vessels, but the earliest activity at Lunca appears to have worked without specialized pottery. That caution matters. Still, this is far beyond somebody accidentally tasting salty water. These people knew where the resource was. They returned repeatedly. They controlled fire around it. And they performed saltworking activities enough times to leave meters of debris. Salt had become work. Which raises the next question. Why were they producing enough of it to leave an archaeological mound behind? So, what was all that salt actually for? The frustrating answer is probably several things. The most obvious is people themselves. Sodium is essential, and once a community knew how to turn brine into concentrated salt, that mineral could be carried away from the spring instead of consumed only where nature happened to put it. Then there were animals. Neolithic communities were increasingly living with livestock, and cattle, sheep, and goats also require sodium. A dependable salt source could therefore serve more mouths than the human ones sitting around the fire. And then salt does something fresh meat finds deeply inconvenient. It helps food last. Heavy salting draws water out of tissues and lowers the amount of water available to many spoilage microbes. That opens a completely different possibility. Meat or fish does not always have to be eaten immediately. Some of it can survive for later. But here we have to resist a very tempting story. At Poiana Slatinei, archaeologists cannot point to the ash mound and say, this part was seasoning, this part fed cattle, and this part preserved dinner. Researchers have left those possibilities open. Exchange is another possibility. That matters because repeated, labor-intensive production may have served more than one purpose. Maybe these communities were solving several problems at once. Feed bodies, support herds, store food, perhaps create surplus. And once salt could be concentrated, stored, and carried away, one final transformation became possible. You no longer needed to live beside the spring to want what came out of it. Romania was not the only place where prehistoric communities eventually solved the salt problem. The interesting part is that there was no universal recipe. Where climate allowed, solar evaporation could let the sun remove much of the water from brine. In colder or less predictable conditions, people could use fuel and heat instead. Across prehistoric Europe, one widespread solution eventually became briquetage, ceramic vessels and supports associated with heating brine, crystallizing salt, and producing forms that could be transported. The earliest briquetage traditions in Central and Eastern Europe appear around the middle of the 5th millennium BC, later than the earliest activity at Poiana Slatinei. Elsewhere, people did not need brine springs at all. Where rock salt reached close to the surface, communities could quarry or mine it. Bronze Age evidence from Transylvania and western Ukraine even includes wooden trough systems interpreted as part of methods for working exposed rock salt with water. Different landscape, different engineering, same white problem. The important point is that salt technology was not one invention that spread everywhere in a single neat line. Communities encountered different geological versions of the same resource and developed different ways to concentrate, extract, and move it. Sunlight in one place, fire in another, pottery somewhere else, direct rock salt extraction where geology allowed it. Humanity kept arriving at the same chemical destination through different doors. And once any of those methods produced more salt than one household immediately needed, another transformation could begin. Salt could move. Once salt could move, it stopped being only a substance. It became a relationship. Imagine one community living beside a productive salt spring and another several days away with livestock, stored food, and no concentrated source nearby. The second group does not need to understand sodium chemistry. They only need to understand that the people near the spring possess something useful. Now salt can be exchanged. Because it can be divided, stored, carried, and consumed gradually, salt fits surprisingly well into networks of movement between communities. Archaeologists studying prehistoric societies have long considered its importance to humans and animals, combined with its uneven distribution, as one reason it could become significant in exchange and, in some contexts, contribute to wealth or status. But we should not imagine every salt spring becoming a prehistoric Wall Street. The social consequences depended heavily on geography. Evidence from Bronze Age Anatolia, for example, has been interpreted as showing that abundant and accessible salt could support largely local or community-level exchange rather than becoming a tightly monopolized prestige resource. Where salt was easy to obtain, controlling it mattered less. Where good sources were scarce or distant, moving it could matter more. That is the larger transformation. A salty spring begins as part of the landscape, then people learn to process it. Then the product leaves the spring. And once it travels between households, herders, settlements, and regions, salt begins carrying something besides sodium: obligations, exchange, access, perhaps prestige. The mineral has become part of social life, and that creates a slightly uncomfortable possibility. The moment something essential can be produced in one place and needed somewhere else, the question is no longer just, how do we get salt? It becomes, who controls the source? This is where a useful mineral becomes slightly less innocent. Salt is essential. Salt sources are not evenly distributed. That combination can create dependency. A community living beside a saline spring could collect or manufacture salt directly. Another community living far away might have to travel for it, trade for it, or depend on somebody else to bring it. As livestock, stored foods, and settled households became more important in some communities, reliable access could matter more. And producing salt was not free. At places where brine had to be heated, people needed fuel, working surfaces or containers, time, and repeated labor. Concentrating salt meant concentrating effort as well. So a good salt source was not just a convenient patch of landscape. It could become a place worth returning to, organizing around, and perhaps controlling. That does not mean every prehistoric salt spring produced chiefs, taxes, guards, and a tiny department of sodium. Archaeology usually cannot tell us exactly who owned a source, who was excluded, or whether access was negotiated peacefully. In some regions, salt was relatively abundant and local. In others, scarcity and distance could make movement and exchange much more important. But the basic tension was now in place. A substance everybody needs could come from a landscape not everyone shared equally. And once that happens, salt is no longer only about taste, survival, or preservation. It becomes about access. Who has it, who needs it, and what they are willing to do to get it. So, what is the real answer? We do not know when the first human discovered salt. We do not know who first tasted a mineral crust, drank from a salty spring, or noticed that certain places drew animals back again and again. Those moments happened too early, and salt itself is too good at disappearing. What we do know is that sodium mattered long before people understood what sodium was. The human body, like the bodies of other mammals, is built to regulate it and to respond when levels fall too low. We also know that by the early Neolithic, some communities were no longer simply encountering salt in nature. They were processing it deliberately. At places like Poiana Slatinei, people repeatedly returned to an intensely saline spring and used fire in a salt-working process thousands of years ago. What happened before that is inference. Humans almost certainly encountered salty foods, coastlines, springs, and mineral deposits much earlier. They may have learned useful locations through taste, observation, repetition, or even by noticing animal behavior. But we cannot reconstruct the first discovery scene. And maybe that is the wrong scene to look for anyway. Ancient humans did not really discover salt as a single object. They discovered how to recognize it, how to return to it, how to extract it, how to carry it, and eventually, how to make an essential mineral scattered through water, food, and stone behave like a resource. Now, look at the salt nearest to you. Maybe it is in a shaker on the table. Maybe it is already hiding in bread, cheese, soup, chips, or whatever modern food has managed to turn sodium into a personality trait. You reach for it without thinking. That tiny movement is the end of a very long story. For a prehistoric salt maker, getting concentrated salt could mean finding the right spring, remembering the route, collecting brine, gathering fuel, building a fire, repeatedly processing salty water, and carrying the result away. Your seasoning aisle really was the entire landscape. The strange part is that the reason any of this mattered has barely changed. Your nerves still depend on sodium. Your muscles still use it. Your body still regulates it with systems far older than farming, pottery, salt mines, supermarkets, or nutrition labels. What changed was everything around that biology. Humans learned to recognize salt in nature, return to reliable sources, concentrate it with heat or sunlight, store it, move it, exchange it, and eventually put it inside a container small enough to sit beside your dinner plate. So, ancient humans probably never had one glorious moment when they discovered salt. They did something more human. They noticed a useful pattern. Then they kept improving it. Until an essential mineral hidden in water, food, and stone became so ordinary that today, when dinner tastes bland, you simply reach across the table. No expedition required.